with your background and presentation. Actually, I would like to give a short introduction to our audience to let them know a little bit more about who is Chris. And actually, Chris is almost like throughout his 18-year career to date, Chris has lived and worked in global settings. Home has been London, the Netherlands, Ethiopia, Switzerland, and currently Turkey. And I got the chance to meet him in Turkey almost more than a year ago, I guess. And his work has taken him from the luxury of Dubai, London, and the Netherlands to several cities in China, to informal settlements in Jakarta, to Ethiopia, and also rural Rajasthan. And actually, today, Chris is joining us from Istanbul, but he freshly came from India, from New Delhi. So it also represents the way how he's traveling globally and really dealing with all the global issues at the same time with his business. And his projects have ranged from difficult brownfield regeneration chains to large master plans, from concept to implementation. Living and working in such different contexts, it has allowed Chris to gain a clear understanding of the challenges of designing, planning, and delivering projects in diverse economic, social, and technical circumstances. Actually, his education equipped Chris to build a career as a landscape and urban designer. Working for and alongside renowned architects, he has been a key part of many award-winning projects. Travels exposed Chris to difficulties faced by many fast-growing megacities and countries that are experiencing rapid and sometimes unpredictable patterns of growth and development. In an ongoing search for tools other than traditional design and planning tools to aid private and public clients, actually, Chris has taken inspiration from organizations such as the Ellen MacArthur Foundation and Project Drawdown. How can we modernize and future-proof our urban areas, buildings, and communities without harming the planet, and while also creating economic impulses? These are very important questions in his agenda. Contemporary challenges require innovative thinking and collaboration between often unexpected parties. Through his Feeding Speed platform, today we will hear a lot about this, and I'm really looking forward. Chris has explored these topics and more, with leading voices joining him for webinars and presentations. In turn, Chris has been invited to speak, of course, in many high-profile events. Now more than ever, we are witnessing extreme unpredictability in energy, utility, and food prices. We are in the midst of climate crisis, while major social, economic, and other tough environmental questions must be addressed immediately. At the same time, many solutions exist. Businesses, both old and new, are developing and implementing remarkable innovations. Now is the moment for a modern approach to urbanism, where every invention we undertake helps to tackle multiple critical challenges while also inspiring and creating opportunity. With a broad urban design background and recent skills developed in his role as a circular economic built environment specialist, Chris is also well equipped to embrace these challenges. Today, actually, we will talk about all his background plus all his work for the future of the city. And the main question actually, when we were talking with him, he addressed to us was, for many years we have been told that many aspects of modern life are incompatible with a health climate. A high consumption, glamorous lifestyle has been sold to us as an inspirational and peak of achievement. But this has come at great cost to society and the planet. Multiple crises are currently colliding, from environmental and climate to physical and mental health, to rampant inflation, rising costs, and falling incomes, to conflicts and food and water insecurity. So can necessity become the mother of invention that stimulates us to find better ways to live more efficiently, enjoyably, affordably, and responsibly? Please welcome Chris, and we are looking forward to host you today after this long introduction.
Well, thank you so much. That was a very kind introduction. Firstly, I just wanted to share a couple of images about where I came from. Feeding Cities is where I'm at right now. But for many years, I was doing standard architecture, landscape and urban design. This was a project in Belfast, Northern Ireland, regenerating the Docklands. But at the heart of it, a iconic award-winning museum for the Titanic, and the Holland and Wolff drawing offices here next door, where many ships were built that sailed the world. It was a challenge and an honor to be involved in such a project. Similarly, Delhi, where I've just returned from, it was my first overseas trip for work in 3 years, actually. Most of the work I've been doing has been online, but this project in Delhi, they took it from Dust Bowl to lush urban environment. And that was the main goal behind this project, was to create places for people that are comfortable, where you can escape in the city. And escape in the city is a big theme for me. It's, we're all living in very dense urban areas, and we need to move away from the need to transport ourselves huge amounts of distance to find relaxation. We need to find that relaxation and mental well-being within the city where we live. And we were quite successfully able to do that in Delhi in a rather unlikely context, really. This is just a few kilometers from the runways of the main airport and less than a kilometer from the highway. But when I was sitting there yesterday, there was birds in the trees. There were even nesting in the trees. And a few years ago, it was this dusty bowl with not a tree in sight. So that was quite rewarding to see how that's grown up so quickly. Now people are using that space. You can see some of the environments that we created here, connecting commercial basement levels underneath a road, so that people can enjoy the shade, the comfort of not having to cross a road, communicating between different commercial developments without having to think about traffic, without hearing the traffic, escaping in the city. But why a recent food focus? Well, in the last 5 years in particular, the food system's really come to the fore of discussions about climate change, about equity, about solving all kinds of problems from social and economic. Prior to Istanbul, I was living in Geneva, Switzerland, where many big organizations came to, amongst others, the UN, to launch their product or launch their documents or share their research. Amongst others that I heard whilst I was living there was the work of Drawdown. As it says here on the book, the most comprehensive plan ever proposed to reverse global warming. And I'll come back to that in a couple of slides' time. Of course, the Milan food policy guidelines were a hot topic in the period that I was there. The Eat Lancet launched their Food Planet Health guideline. How can we eat for a healthy person and a healthy planet? What sort of food should we be eating? How should our diet be composed if we're going to live within the boundaries that the planet can offer us? And the work of the Ellen MacArthur Foundation, in particular, their document, Cities and the Circular Economy for Food. And of course, this big spider here, the sustainable food systems at the heart of all of the SDGs. And this image, for many years, I was traveling backwards and forwards to Jakarta, where I was part of a consortium looking at in particular, the flooding issues. Jakarta floods from the land side and from the ocean side. Some parts of the city are sinking at 30 to 50 centimeters plus each year due to subsidence, due to groundwater extraction, compaction. So it's threatened by rising sea levels on one side, and subsidence, meaning that water coming down from the mountains and upstream cannot enter the sea. So at peak moments, the city fills up like a basin. It's being filled from both sides, and rivers with no capacity to take anything. They're full with junk. So that got me thinking, we can come up with engineering solutions to deal with this issue of flooding. But if the waterways look like this, we're not going to get very far. No, but where is this junk coming from? That was the starting point for my kind of exploration into the whole feeding cities and food systems in the urban context. I discovered, for example, that in 2017, European countries dispose of 1/6 of their plastic waste by just shipping it abroad. Out of sight, out of mind. Here's a study from the news and the BBC from a couple of years ago, where Turkey was also a dumping ground for other countries' waste. 15 million plastic bottles being thrown away every day in the UK. but it takes about 7 liters of water to produce 1 plastic bottle. We see now many parts of the world, including Western Europe, suffering extreme droughts. More than 500 billion plastic shopping bags used around the world every year, 1 million bags a minute. In the USA, unfathomable amounts of polystyrene cups being disposed of every year. And at the moment, a very linear system where very little is collected or recirculated, and the majority of it ending up either incinerated, landfilled, or leakage. And what do we mean by leakage? Apart from the rivers that I showed you, for example, in Jakarta, we have things such as the Great Pacific Garbage Patch, full of plastic, bigger than France, Germany, and Spain combined. Absolutely frightening amounts of waste, much of which is in some way or other related to the way that our foods are distributed. Some of it essential, some of it non-essential. Lots of arguments about whether packaging is good, bad, or ugly, but we cannot deny that this is a challenge that we all need to be taking on. Another element of the food system that was absolutely frightening is the amount of emissions produced from our agri-food systems, the amount of freshwater use, and of course, tropical deforestation and habitat loss. And we're seeing now in the climate crisis that the Earth's ability to absorb the pollution that we inflict on it is becoming increasingly diminished. It's a big struggle now for the planet to cope with everything we're throwing at it. And if we continue to eat and farm the way that we are at the moment, we risk deforesting an area twice the size of India. So at a moment when we need more capacity to absorb the gases that we're chucking into the air, we're reducing the planet's ability to do so. So all elements of land use, about lifestyle, about diet, about food production, that get my brain thinking. How can we, as urban designers, as architects, as landscape architects, take this on? This is where we can make a big, big difference. And there are huge savings in not only from emissions, but also from water use to land degradation, with massive economic potential benefits. So these are not small issues. These are big issues that can have big economic benefits and huge environmental benefits if we get it right. Most people think of solutions to the environment and climate crisis lying in energy, which of course is a big part of it, but a big, big part of it is our wasteful use of land. With, cities don't take up that much floor area on the planet, but our food systems do. They consume vast, vast quantities of land. So it's no surprise that you see food solutions at the top of the most impactful ways to deal with our current crisis. Reducing food waste and switching our diets can have an enormous impact in reducing our impact. If we look at the big food wasters, and we see Australia and the US at the top, but Turkey's not too far behind. This was data from Statista. And not only are we wasting land, we're also wasting all the resources that go into the food that we produce. If we're not using it, we're already producing more than everybody needs. We produce more calories than everybody needs on average, but a lot of it doesn't get into bellies. And a lot of the waste that's left behind is just waste. It's not seen as a resource. It's seen as waste and it's disposed of. And many of the valuable elements in that waste are not looped. You can see here less than 2% of what has value makes it back into the system. So we need to move away from that linear system back into a more looped way of looking at things. All of this water, chemical inputs, fossil energy, soil, all of these valuable inputs, many of which cannot be replaced, cannot be easily refurbished, are being lost. Huge monetary values. This was a study that we did in Switzerland with Devor, where they installed smart bins in a couple of restaurants. I'll go through this very quickly because otherwise we'll run out of time today, but you can see that within just 1 month here, 5 restaurants, 32,000 francs, which is about, that's probably these days $40,000 US or something in terms of waste in a month across 5 restaurants. So it's monetarily, the monetary value, but also an enormous amount of associated CO2 and enormous amount of associated water, and of course, nourishment going down the bin. The project, the Eats Lancet Foundation suggested how we could eat within planetary boundaries. And when I see these inspirational meals that all, according to their scientific study, are good for the planet, they also look particularly inspirational. And having recently moved to Turkey, not entirely dissimilar from the fantastic banquets that are on offer here. So we're not asking people to make a radical change from what they're used to. We're asking people to make some adjustments to the way that the ingredients are composed. And all of this, I imagine, can be achieved in a much more planet-sensitive way without losing the wonderful experience of textures, colors, flavors, and enjoyment that you have on these Turkish tables. Yeah, you can see here the challenge that we're facing. Some studies suggest that we all need to reduce our individual footprints, average footprints, to 0.6 tons of CO2. For example, in the EU, we're at 8.4, Turkey, an average of 5.2. We've got a long way to go. And yet the food system can be a relatively easy way without us all having to throw our lifestyles completely upside down. For example, here, I've taken, this isn't by any means everybody's complete diet for a week. You can see these are ingredients that you may eat 4 times a week, 3 times a week, 6 times a week. Just these ingredients together potentially have an emission of CO2 of 1.8 tons if you eat this diet every week for a year. Whereas if you would switch some of those to, for example, plant-based alternatives, you could reduce that from 1.8 tons to 136 kilos. So small shifts, massive impact. And it's not only CO2, I think that sometimes clouds the discussion when we only focus on one aspect of the climate crisis, but you see here also, the first option that I shared needed nearly 1,200 bathtubs of water to produce, the second one 350. So the water savings are huge. And the land use, nearly 500 car parking spaces for the first meal, about 50 for the second. So small tweaks to the diet, massive impacts on the planet. This part relates to the second question, I think.
Yeah, I mean, after listening all this information, actually, I mean, with all these sustainable solutions, actually, you are working on in urban cities. And how do you think actually architectural design systems can be improved in metropolitan cities to support sustainability? I mean, is it possible, or how can we manage this? Can you please enlighten us?
Yeah, I mean, I think, a big part of it is, like I said, the linear system, the take, make, waste, is a system that we can't really afford anymore. We need to be thinking more about closing loops and about finding efficiencies and finding synergies. And the title that I suggested for this talk was necessity is the mother of invention. And as budgets are squeezed, and as people's bottom line is squeezed, you need to be finding lots of efficiency savings in ways that you can reduce your own expenditure, in ways that you can find synergies between functions, between land uses. And even here, I mean, this was a study that I was particularly looking at the food sector and greenhouses, closed environment agriculture. There could be lots of interesting relationships here by nearby activities using the outputs of greenhouses, for example. Perhaps there is water that can be captured. There may be forms of waste that can be reused. There may be forms of packaging that can be reused. Also, between different establishments, depending what plants you're growing, depending what techniques you're using, there may be materials from one that are a good input for the next. So it's about not viewing waste, but looking at resources and finding ways to share that through smart clustering, through establishing networks, and really, trying to find sensible loops that can be closed. Another big question when it comes in particular to greenhouse and closed environment agriculture, for example, is what is your bill for heating? Sometimes in the summer you've got plenty of free light and plenty of free heat, but in the winter, in more northern climates, you're spending a lot of money on heat. If you may be located on an industrial estate with nearby producers or data center these days who have enormous amounts of excess heat from cooling the building, is that heat interesting to use? in another function. CO2 from buildings could be interesting for helping plant growth. So there's many different things that we've traditionally considered to be waste that can be useful inputs. And I think that's where architecture and urban planning can come in, looking at smart clustering in particular.
Interesting, yes, of this kind of combination. At this point, maybe it will be important to ask this question. What do you think is sustainability? Because everyone keeps saying sustainability. And what kind of sustainability are we talking about in your terms?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I've put down here that what is the definition of sustainability? The ability to be maintained at a certain rate or level, and the avoidance of depletion of natural resources in order to maintain an ecological balance. If I take the first one, if we continue doing what we're doing, if we're sustaining at the current level, then we're going to go downhill very fast. So we need to be looking at the second one, the avoidance of the depletion of natural resources, which brings me on to the circular economy definition, which is primarily about designing out waste, making sure that you can reuse materials and keep materials in circulation at the highest value. So it's a bit of a mindset switch. Sustainability, we need to move beyond that. We need to move beyond that. We need to be thinking about regeneration and really about designing out waste and efficiencies. And I think, the current challenges that people are facing to their own budgets, in particular, it focuses people's mind an awful lot. And that might mean that we need to, that we need to tackle multiple problems in single solutions. Everything we do needs to tick multiple boxes. This was a study that I did as part of a conference with Project Drawdown, looking at their top solutions and how you might be able to cluster those for mutual benefits. Similarly, I've taken that into other projects. And it's about those relationships, not thinking about every project as an island or every solution as just doing one job, but seeing how many different challenges we can tackle as we go through a building process. I'd like to share this example here, which is a retrofit of a rooftop in Rotterdam. And Rotterdam in the last few years has spent a lot of time, energy, effort in exploring their rooftops. They have 14.5 million square meters of empty flat roofs. And they thought, well, that's a massive opportunity for what can we do with that? And they have the rooftop festival. But taking this rooftop, for example, it produces a little bit of food, which is used in the cafe on the roof. But there's more to this roof than just a little bit of greening, a little bit of food, and a cafe. It is also what they call it, it's a smart roof. It's the slimme dak in Dutch. It can store an enormous amount of rainwater. So by adding this roof, they had to make sure that the roof was structurally capable of this retrofit. That was a big challenge, and not every roof would be appropriate for this. But by retrofitting this roof, they managed to create basically a reservoir on the roof. And in the urban context, that means that this building is having much less impact when there's torrential rains, which we're seeing more and more. It can absorb a lot of water and release it slowly into the drains rather than the drains being inundated by the downspouts from the roof. It also means that, as particularly the upper levels of the building, have a much better heat efficiency. They need less cooling, they need less heating. It gives a place, if I go to the next slide, where you can escape in the city. I'm coming back to that slide again. You go up on the rooftop and wow, that you feel like you've escaped, you've got out of it. You're not looking only at the cars going past. You're not only looking at, 6, 10, 20 stories of building. Now you're looking at some rooftops a little bit further away. Your mind can escape a little bit further than 15 meters to the next wall. And whilst underneath these plants, some of which you're eating in the restaurant, there's a lot of work going on in terms of helping the building function better, more efficiently, use less resources, less impact on the urban drainage systems. So I think finding those solutions that tick multiple boxes and help us tackle multiple challenges is really where I see the role of sustainability. It's about going beyond those single solutions of just a few solar panels on a roof.
I mean, I like this approach a lot. But you know also very well that there are some biggest obstacles in architecture to progress actually solutions for food waste. And what do you think? What are these obstacles? Can you please describe a little bit according to your expertise?
Yeah, I put down just a couple of bullets on this one. I mean, a big problem is mindset. This whole switching people's view of, is it waste or is it resources? Out of sight, out of mind. We're very used to just putting the garbage in the bin and it's gone, but it has to go somewhere. And what's happening with it? And the convenience of being able to just put something in the bin and it's gone. I don't need to think about it. Habits. People are just used to dealing with waste in a certain way. But that's not necessarily the best way or the best use of the resources that we end up disposing of. So I think there's a big issue of mindset. But of course, also in the urban context, you know, before we moved to Istanbul, we had a garden and I had a 9.5 square meter vegetable garden. And it was quite easy for us to compost the stuff from the garden, the clippings from the hedge, the grass clippings from the lawn, mixed with the green waste from the kitchen in a heap in the corner of the garden, and that would go back into the vegetable garden every year, and you would see a benefit from that. But I'm living now in an apartment. Where would I put a compost bin? And it's not organized communally. And a lot of people here aren't interested in organizing it communally. So retrofitting it would be quite a challenge. Although, you know, there are increasingly appealing smart bins that can fit in domestic kitchens that don't release odor, that turn your food waste into compost very quickly. But again, how much compost do you need if you've got a balcony with 3 pot plants? Exactly. And you can produce it, but where's it going to go? So that we need to think about that strategy, about how can we capture the value of all the organic matter that can be extremely useful and extremely valuable. But how do we manage that in an urban context? That's a big challenge on the domestic side. I think on the commercial side, it's probably a little bit easier. But here, I mean, it's also about thinking outside the box. Especially in Istanbul, you have a high tea and coffee culture. It means a lot of grounds and a lot of bags. You can be creative with that. You can use the empty spaces and grow mushrooms. And so it's about viewing that waste as an opportunity. And there's plenty of people who are doing this, but that's about that mindset change again. And then you're not having to transport that waste miles away where it will rot on a landfill releasing methane. You're capturing it, you're using it, somebody else is turning it into a business model. You've got a relationship going, you're building this little local ecosystem where there's less transportation of waste, there's less transportation or input of the food. You're using empty spaces in buildings. So there's many reasons why it might be appealing to explore this. And on a larger scale, you see, for example, this tomato box, the cardboard was partially made with the parts of the plants that you don't eat. At the end of the growing season, you're left with a lot of woody stems from the tomato plants. Can that be used to make the packaging that you then distribute the fruits in? Other companies, for example, collecting citrus peels and using them for coloring scents, fiber structure, cleaning products, you name it. So there's increasingly a large market for food waste upcycling, which creates new opportunities as well. And I think that out of the box thinking is going to be critical and finding those links and those synergies. But the big challenge is putting the infrastructure in place and identifying what you've got where and who can use it.
I think, yeah, this mindset issue is the key part for everything, actually. Like trying to, if we can solve that, I think we will solve a lot of problems in the near future.
I think I would also add to that, one of the biggest problems, especially if you're looking at food waste, is cross-contamination. Well, in any kind of waste, one of the big obstacles to recycling or upcycling or reuse is cross-contamination of different types of waste. You know, if within all of the organics, there's some plastics and tin and some metal, that needs sorting, that needs filtering before you can use it. So how you properly segregate the waste when it's being disposed of is another challenge for the ability to reuse it.
In that sense, maybe I ask my next question for you, as we discussed before. I mean, in the far future, what do you think about development in cities with sustainable systems? In other words, do you think sustainable urban cities can grow into sustainable metropolitan cities? Is it possible?
Is it possible? I think, well, I think it has to happen, because there's no way that even with all of the urban ag initiatives, you can ever feed cities from within cities. So you're going to be heavily reliant on your hinterland, and even the hinterland cannot provide all of the calories and all of the food types that a city needs. And it's not sensible to do so either. There's a lot of foods that, you know, we rely on soya, we rely on wheat, we rely on, you know, big grain production. You can't do that within cities or even close to cities. Other things you can do close to cities. And it will be sensible to do so. I think we need to be more smart about how we use the food around cities and close, you know, the metropolis is gobbling up more and more of the land around it. But that's also how we value that land and how it is used. I think clustering, cooperating, and connecting are key terms as we go for that. Finding smarter synergies. This was, you know, we looked at a development plan for a small town in the Netherlands, projecting it through 2030 and beyond 2050, and just looking at how this sort of fairly monotone, big box logistics out of town developments could become more integrated in terms of energy use, synergies, logistics, connectivity. And I think there's going to be more of that born out of necessity as well. People will find each other, find better ways to be more efficient with inputs and outputs. But I think, you know, as pressure on land and resources becomes more intense, we're going to have to be looking harder at multiple land use and multiple building use. It's already happening. You see things, for example, here, a lot of energy being generated on the roof of a car park here. And with a switch towards electric vehicles and car sharing, it can be quite interesting in the daytime when this is performing optimally, that energy that's generated can be stored in the cars that are parked underneath, because that's always a big question with solar. It's not working at night. How do you store it? Cars with the batteries, that's one potential big option. People drive in the daytime. By the time they leave, the battery is full. So that there's initiatives like that happening. You know, I shared the mushrooms from Other Waste, Toronto, powering its garbage trucks with the biogas generated from the food scraps that they collect. So there are people starting to find these interesting connections, and I think that's going to be more important. One project I did in Ireland was with a very small urban farmer, taking what I call an urban lazy space. It was the flat roof of the warehouse where he kept cut flowers. He was a cut flower importer prior to the COVID pandemic. But then when all big events stopped due to the pandemic, the cut flower business was pretty much dead on its feet. And he flipped into small scale urban agriculture on the rooftop of his warehouse, and then expanded that into a peri-urban market garden situation out of town. And that relation, you need that. You can't, like I said, you cannot produce all the food that you need on the variety of crops that you need in a city, in an urban context. Some stuff it's smart to do there, some stuff you have to do out of town. Finding those connections and making sure that, you know, the city allows that to still take place is going to be very important as we go forwards. You can see here what he was growing out of town on the left and in town on the right. And finding those combinations of what is it smart to grow where will be very important. And, you know, the food system, it taps everybody. It's the stakeholders are all the way through from nature to commodity traders and everything in between. So the sustainable metropolis is going to have to embrace that idea as well, finding those connections and making it work smarter.
Yeah, I mean, in a way, I keep thinking when you're doing your presentation, like we need also like many distributed, how can I say, like distributed centralized systems, like not only one center. Like that's why this composing and connecting and the terms that you are discussing, they become important, and clustering. So we need several centers, not only one. Like everything needs to be connected also to each other somehow. That's what I keep recognizing, that it will be very important also for this designing all those systems in the urban city level.
Yeah, absolutely.
And, my favorite projects you have in your circular compound project, you designed a system about how people can become part of the solution of the problems in fast-growing cities. And with people becoming part of a solution, actually, my question is, do you think that people can also become part of the architectural design in sustainable architecture?
Yeah, I think it's essential that, I mean, if people don't buy into the ideas, then it's not going to happen. You can try and impose stuff, but if people don't see a benefit for themselves, then it's not going to happen. So you need to look at what solutions people need, what solutions people see the benefit from and want to take ownership of. And that's what I was trying to explore here. It was tricky because, you know, in this context, most people occupying the sides of the waterway were living there illegally or semi-legally, or however you want to describe it or define it. And giving them a say in the process was quite threatening for the local authority. To give those people who, in their eyes, aren't supposed to be there, any kind of say in the matter, sort of legitimize their presence. You know, there was all kinds of issues. It would take a brave decision for that process to have gone further. But you know, in other places it is happening. But the solutions I was looking at were ones that I felt would have the most benefits to the people living there, and therefore be adopted by them. You know, if they see a need for it, if they see a purpose behind it, if they see opportunity in the solutions, then they will take it and run with it. Because at the end of the day, people are looking for, you know, employment and food and opportunity, but it needs to be matched to the situation where you are. So here I showed a whole range of examples from, you know, just making use of the things that are lying around in a creative way, to, in the first instance, clean up the rubbish. Some of it would be exported, some of it could be reused, some of it would be implemented into new schemes, some of it would be sold on, some of it would be trashed. And then moving steps forwards to create a situation where it's in everyone's best interests not to litter that waterway, because it started off as the lifeblood. The reason that the cities grow up around the waterways is because it provided the water that they needed to grow the food in the first place. You know, historically, we weren't importing our food from miles and miles away. But as we started to import it, the waterways became less valuable, and we started to, you know, mistreat them and abuse them to the point that they're a hazard rather than an asset. And I was looking at ways, how can we sort of switch that back to becoming, so it becomes an asset that you don't want to abuse. I'd like to just switch to one example of where I think the public participation has worked quite well, and that's Paris, where they had the Pariculture initiative, exploring again the reimagination of rooftops, supported by policy and various city-led schemes. You know, I mean, this was one on a very large scale, the new conference center in Paris, but a lot of leafy greens production on top of a conference center, with the idea that it's supplying the hospitality below. But the Pariculture initiative for me is in many ways about giving people the opportunity to get involved. You know, this is the challenge. This is what we want to achieve. Everybody needs to get on board here. Come with your ideas. And it was oversubscribed, and people have really run with it, and they've achieved an awful lot. But it needs to be that balance between identifying the problem, coming up with a few ideas that get the ball rolling, and then being the facilitator. Cities need to be the facilitator, I think. And without the people, it's not going to happen. Mm-hmm. But if the people have the ideas and not the opportunity, it's not going to happen either. So it's bringing those two things together. People need to see that they're allowed to do something and a benefit for them in doing it.
It's very important to combine them together on both sides. Definitely. No. Nature should also become part of it, and architecture also find solutions for it. So sustainable design focuses on a system that can work and develop on its own in general. But throughout time, with technological developments in the future, the sustainable design may need alterations, and which may take the initial design unsustainable in the long run. What do you think about this paradox?
Yeah, again, I put down a couple of, this was me sort of brain dumping as I was thinking about the question. You know, I think whenever you're formulating these sustainable or, you know, more resilient strategies, you need people to really believe it. You need to buy it. People need to buy into it. They need to have ownership of the idea and the solution, and understanding why are we doing it? What's it for? You know, planning for the operation and the maintenance that needs to take place, because otherwise you see, yeah, what I put here, the box ticking exercise in the concept, the marketing and the first implementation. Look, we're green. But if it's not backed up by, well, who's going to own this? Who's going to operate it? Who's going to look after it? And why are we doing it? Then you end up shooting yourself in the foot. You see examples like this. This is from several years ago, but it's been repeated many times since. Council slammed for spending a whole bunch of money on a living wall of plants which dried out and died. And that gives the whole movement a bad reputation. It's like, oh, yeah, all of these things, they look good on paper, but look at it now. Because nobody understood why we were doing it. What was the purpose of it? Was it just wallpaper? Was it an expensive wallpaper? Would it have been better just to have, you know, a facade made out of something else? You need to know why you're doing it, and it needs to make sense. Otherwise, you know, someone will look at a spreadsheet and say, well, that's costing a lot of money every year, or we've no idea how to maintain it, or, you know, something will break, and by the time the guy comes to repair it, the whole thing's dead. And then you've got no budget to replant it. Or so understanding what you're doing, why you're doing, and how you're going to look after it, I think is a really big part that we've not always understood up to now. And I saw exactly the same thing this morning in Delhi on the way to the airport. I mean, I don't know, even in the best of circumstances, the plants are going to struggle there underneath the flyover, surrounded by 3 lanes of traffic on either side, underneath a flyover where the sun never comes, where dust is blowing all around, where people are living homeless underneath a shelter. Is this the way that we should be spending our money? Is this how you buy people into the idea of we're going to live more sustainably, more resource aware? And this is a terrible example of, you know, perhaps a good intention, but this is setting you back. This isn't helping your cause. This isn't tackling any of the big issues. Perhaps at the end, you know, there's so many more things you could have done with that space underneath that would help drive your, you know, drive towards zero waste, or, you know, waste transformation. There's many other things we could have done that would also give the people who are rough sleeping under there an opportunity. This just, yeah, for me, it was a big failure, that thing. And the other thing that you talked about, or in the question, was like, what looks good on paper might not be so good in practice. And, you know, I mean, these are the images that, you know, 6, 7, 8 years ago, I looked at it and I was like, wow, that's the future of food. That looks great. That's amazing. And it looks amazing. It's very sci-fi. It's very colorful. It's very photogenic. It's very Instagram or TikTok. But it's also very fragile. These schemes are phenomenal in terms of water savings and amazing in terms of reducing the need for pesticides and fertilizers, avoiding runoff into natural systems, producing enormous amounts of produce on very small areas of land, producing fresh produce where otherwise you might have to import it over long distances. Fantastic things, absolutely great. But the energy bills are killing a lot of these projects. The energy bills are huge, and there are huge steps forwards in terms of the lighting and better cooling systems, but still, that's an element that really needs to be very carefully considered when we go for this, is by producing these products here, is this better than where we were getting them from before? And we need to ask those questions when we're doing what we think is sustainable, what we think is the right thing. We need to compare, how are we doing it now? And is this new solution better? And we need to look at so many different criteria. You can argue this one for maybe 7 or 8 out of 10, but those last 2 could be critical. They could be critical.
Yes. It's so challenging, the subject.
It's incredible. And I mean, the latest book that I was reading from George Monbiot, really, he digs into the food system in many, many different ways. And just reading that book also got me thinking in many different ways, and that posing new questions about assumptions that I'd made, or questioning some of the stories that I've been told. And it is an absolute challenge. You know, food, like it affects everything. It affects everything, and that's why I find it so fascinating in the urban context, because we're living in dense urban areas on small footprints.
Exactly.
But the amount of land and the amount of resources needed to sustain those cities is absolutely phenomenal.
In that sense, these solutions for food systems in architecture generally, as you said, consist of either vertical gardens or rooftop gardens, greenhouse additions, and high-tech farms like these ones. Other than implementative solutions, how do you think food system solution can be implemented into the architecture? And are there other solutions?
Are there other solutions? Oh, there are so many. I mean, food systems is such a big thing. You know, I wanted to share this because food systems is one element. It's such a broad topic. We can produce only limited amounts of food in urban areas. It can be extremely valuable in terms of avoiding, you know, transportation, particularly refrigerated transportation, which may have quite a high impact, or may see that nutrient loss if we're transporting highly perishables across a large distance. Other foods, growing them locally doesn't make so much sense because the actual environmental impact of the transportation is so small compared to other aspects. So growing food in urban areas, it needs to be more than just the food. I think it needs to be about that mindset change, about that lifestyle change, about introducing people to new ways of thinking about food, about understanding what they're eating, and about, you know, we hear a lot about food deserts across many rich countries. There's a lot of people who experience, I think, nutrition poverty. They can get access to calories, but they're not getting access to nutrition. And I think that's somewhere where urban food systems can have a big role. I wanted to move on to this example here, which is Project Eats in the US, which is a wonderful story. You can view it on their website and on YouTube. There's plenty of examples of what they've been doing. This is in a very urban context in Manhattan, but they also have community-based agriculture schemes in very, very deprived neighborhoods, which have allowed people to find new meaning in themselves, find their way towards a better future by just believing in themselves again and being connected. If people are hungry, they get angry. You know, I've got 3 kids, and if it's past lunchtime, then they start to get grouchy. They start to get angry. If you miss 2 or 3 meals, or if you're not eating properly for a week, you get frustrated. You get, you know, it's not good for anything. And so a healthy city has healthy people. Healthy kids need to have a healthy stomach. You're not going to concentrate or learn or focus at school if you're hungry. Food bills can be huge for schools, and in many deprived areas, many urban areas, people just don't have access to nutrition. They have access to calories, but not nutrition. And I think that's a big part of where urban agriculture can come in, allowing people to grow some of that nutrition and, you know, feel at least in control of part of their lives. But what the urban context also allows us to do is to benefit from shared economy. And that can, you know, this is an example where you can, rather than buying everything, you can borrow stuff. But if you take that into the food system, we can look at the shared economy for shared kitchens, for all kinds of ways to avoid food waste, to preserve food, to keep nutrient value in food that would otherwise be spilt, to allow people who don't have access to good food to get access to good food, to introduce people to new types of meals that are better for them and better for the planet, and also to, you know, better ways of distributing food. You know, maybe you don't need to buy that huge bag, or maybe you can only afford to buy a small amount. But if you buy a small amount in a small packet, you end up with lots of small packets that need to be disposed of. If you can buy it in a zero waste scheme, then you don't have those heaps of small packages. That was one of the challenges that I saw in particular India, Indonesia, but also here. If you've only got a small wage, or if you're being paid every day, then you buy small quantities of food every day. And if it's pre-packaged, then you're producing an awful lot of packaging for a relatively small amount of food. And in an urban context, especially when we're getting used to now home delivery services, perhaps we can plug into better collect and return schemes. We can build that into how we build our buildings, how we create the infrastructure that supports that better distribution of particularly small quantities of food, so you can get what you want without having to buy too much that might expire, or if you can't afford it, without buying too much packaging compared to the amount of product that you need. And of course, there's so many creative solutions, and you need to look at what's wise for you. What I like about this is it's a pretty simple system. It's a soil-based system. It's super efficient. It's designed by an Australian company in Melbourne. And, you know, they trialed it over a couple of car parking bays and produced 450 kilos of veggies in a 12-month period. And that's a pretty simple plug-and-play system. It was upcycled plastic from the crisp packaging industry that they made their wicking bed, water-smart growing modules from. It's extremely water efficient, and it's got it produces a high amount of valuable nutrition in an urban area, and you don't need that much infrastructure. It's a plug and play system. You can drop it in where it's needed, which I think is great. It's not one of these high tech where you have to be a chemist to mix the chemical mixtures that drip feed into your intravenous lettuces, which also have a role to play. But this is very much a hands-on. And that compost, that's got to come from somewhere too. So if you plug it into an urban composting scheme, now this example is from a school here in Istanbul. They have a farm out of town, and in this city campus, they have a composting machine where scraps that are left from snack time, from the canteen, go into a relatively small composter, which is pretty efficient. And that can then go back into the landscape around the campus to make the soil better, to make it more robust, make the soil more robust, make it more drought tolerant, make the soil better able to cope with downpours, because a healthy soil can absorb more water. So, you know, you don't get issues of erosion when it storms. So there's many reasons why you can look at embracing the food system. And here on the right, an example of where students could get thinking about aquaponic systems as part of, you know, their hands-on tech makerspace. So you can embrace all aspects of education, as well as in teaching people about the impact of their food, the choices of their diet, the opportunities for micro business, for all aspects. You can teach everything through food, I think. This was a study we did in Switzerland. The product on the right was a green belly that was developed by a Spanish architect and his food scientist colleague. They suggested that their modules are very simple to create. This was using a scaffolding system and some standard modular elements. But they took the idea, the inspiration from dead facades, blank facades, of which there are many. I interpreted it as a way that you could enhance the performance of this building. This is a sports hall with a library above. It gets extremely hot in the summer because that facade is exposed to the sun, and it's a very thin facade on an oldish building. So it costs the school a lot of money and energy in the summer to cool it. And in the winter, it's quite exposed and it costs a lot of money to heat it. So I thought, well, what if we would, you know, there's quite a bit of open space in front of that. Imagine if you would skin it with this relatively slimline system for food production. What could it do? Potentially, I mean, this hasn't been worked out exactly, and it depends on the crops that you grow and climate and various aspects, particularly skills, how skilled you are as a grower. You could produce a significant quantity of food, which could then go straight into the canteen, giving kids a highly nutritious farm to fork lunchtime meal. We took the Australian example of those car park based modules and projected that onto the school's 120 open air car parking spaces. And again, the production was huge. If they would sacrifice the car parking spaces, they could basically feed the kids a significant portion of veggies for about 2/3 of the school term every day for their lunch. So that would, again, chip away at the amount of budget that goes on buying in food. and in this example, potentially result in energy savings for cooling and heating of that particular building.
They're amazing projects.
I think that's it's looking at what does this solution offer, not just in terms, you have to look at it from so many angles. Can I find something that's going to help tick several boxes?
Mm-hmm.
And I just wanted to share this example as well. It says in Istanbul, a small park wedged in between large compound developments. And on the face of it, it is a ornamental garden. But when you get into it, almost everything is edible. It's lined, the paths are lined with mulberry bushes. There are quince trees, apple trees, pear trees, fig trees, pomegranate bushes. There's olive trees, there's pines with pine nuts. So all of this, we don't have to choose. We don't have to say we only want a park. The park can be a farm, but it doesn't look like a farm. It's producing a whole heap of food, and you can choose whether you want to formally collect that, formally farm it, and use it in the cafe, which you see here on the bottom right image. If you can add value to it, you could turn it into jams, chutneys. You could use it to bake cakes. You could add value to it rather than just being a raw ingredient. Or you could do what happens now. People come in and they harvest. People go in there and they enjoy it. You can grab apricots. You can grab mulberries. The kids walk through it and they see each season. They see different flowers. They see different fruits. And so we don't have to make that choice between either this or that. We can combine things together. And allow people to get that relationship with nature, to understand about food grows. How does it grow? Where does it grow? Can I eat that? And we can do so much more with it, or we can just let it become an amenity, a resource. Parks originally, they were an amenity. It's to give people who don't have a garden a space to recreate, to enjoy, to be outdoors. But we can also load that with a lot of other things as well. There's some examples. You see the mulberry bushes on the bottom right. I think in June they were absolutely loaded, and the park was full of people just filling up their boxes and eating them direct from the tree. It's great. Just see, in every season you see something different.
Mm-hmm. I'm so inspired. I'm taking notes for myself. And okay, towards almost we came to the end of our talk, but of course our last question is always the most inspiring one, in my opinion. And what are your plans for future? Do you have any new projects, or what is waiting for you?
Yeah, like you said, I got back from Delhi this lunchtime, just after lunch today, where I was on my first foreign trip for 3 years, back in Delhi, a city that I've been to many times, and in many ways inspired me to take this sort of sidestep or a different focus in my work. And I'm not keen on travel for work with associated footprints and whatever, but I felt that it was important to say yes to this project. It's a big residential project that is about to commence, where 34-story sizable blocks will be introduced in a new neighborhood, a new area. And that brings a lot of opportunities to start introducing right at the concept design stage these ideas of how are we going to manage waste? How are we going to build that landscape? What's that landscape going to have in it? How are we going to manage water? Can we make sure that the way that we do the soil, the soak away, the drainage feeds the soil, that we can over time reduce or eliminate the need for artificial irrigation? How are we going to build in flood resilience? How are we going to cope with heat stress? What experiences can we put in there that help people escape in the city? So I felt it was important to get in at this stage and share those ideas and explain why I think it's interesting for the client to take it on board and how that could be used to help sell the scheme, what's in it for the new user. And that's a bit of a challenge in this scheme, because in the context of this category or this level of apartment, many of them will be bought by investors, so they're not the end user. So then you have to convince the client to buy into an idea that he can sell to an investor, who can then use it in his marketing to a tenant. so that becomes a bit of a challenge. Who's going to benefit from what we're doing here? The client needs to, in the first instance, is interested in, is it going to help me sell the project faster? Is it going to save me money, or is it going to cost me more?
Yeah.
The investor is interested in, is this a good marketing strategy? Is it going to help me lease this for more money to a better tenant? So it's great. It's a great one for thinking about, why are we doing this, and who's going to benefit, and how am I going to get this accepted? What are the carrots that are going to get people to buy into these ideas? Yeah, so I'm really excited to be working on that scheme, and my brain's been ticking over with all kinds of ideas about how we can work in conjunction with the architects to identify possible or likely waste streams in the construction process, and how can what we would traditionally consider waste elements in the build can become inputs for the landscape design, as you always have offcuts and over order. And if we can identify it now, what might be those likely excesses, and is there any opportunity for us to use that elsewhere on the scheme? Then that can be a good way for us to reduce the overall impact. Other ways, yeah, there's a lot of things going on in my head about how we can make this a scheme which has a lot less impact and a lot more resilience going forwards. I noticed particularly here, where we pay a monthly charge for the maintenance on our compound. If it was up to me, I could introduce several different small investments now that would deliver, shall we say, price stability going forwards. And I think price stability is going to be a big one as well. You see now rising costs each month for the maintenance associated with the need to irrigate more, or there was lots of different reasons why it costs more each month to maintain the place that you live in. And if you can identify at the outset ways to keep control over that, then that's also interesting. So, move into this compound and your monthly expenditure is going to be relatively stable. And then in these days of extreme inflation and extreme price fluctuations, that's also an important selling point. How can you give people some sort of clarity about what is going to be my expenditure? And another scheme that I'm working on is the introduction of very small scale specific urban food production at a organization's office compound, where they have an on-site cafeteria, an on-site kitchen. They also have a lot of outside spaces which are underutilized, and they wanted them beautified. And I said, well, can we have a look and see if we can do beautification and selective specific food production as well, in order to enhance the visual appearance, the usability of spaces, and provide some interesting ingredients for the kitchen. And to work with the kitchen, that they also work with the garden and landscape maintenance staff to give us some decent compost to enhance the landscape, and do a little closed loop on site as well. So those things are keeping my brain active these months.
Amazing. Chris, thank you very much really for your time and for all those information that you shared with us. Even though you were so tired, you took part of this talk, but really precious really for us. And I got also a lot of new inspirations and ideas from you to collaborate. And I am looking forward to collaborating in one of our projects in the near future. Hopefully, we will get chances to test or at least develop, to change some mindsets for people in the near future. Thank you very much for all your time.